Before we get started formally, we're going to have a few introductions, and Kim Kristen-Withy is going to start us off.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Center for Digital Scholarship and Creation. I'm Kim Kristen-Withy, one of the co-directors of the center, along with my esteemed colleague, Trevor Bond, who seems to have escaped from the libraries for the moment. He's usually here. You'll see him. He has a bow tie. You can't miss him. So I want to welcome everyone here this morning to the center. It did stop raining for a few minutes, so good. I'm glad. The center, the CDSC opened last year, and wait, is that true? No. Come on in, guys. The center opened last year, and we're a partnership between the College of Arts and Sciences and the libraries, and we're really focused on promoting collaborations that are socially empowering and ethically minded. So we really focus on bringing people together to use technology for very specific cultural, social, political purposes. So last year we started off and we had a spring speaker series. This is our very first fall symposium, and we hope to keep this going each year and bring a set of innovative scholars, the likes of which we have here today. So I just wanted to welcome everyone to the center and welcome you to come back. We have programming all year. We have WordPress workshops. We're going to have an Omeka workshop. We're going to have a wiki storming workshop in the spring. So please check out the website for everything that's going on here. So without further ado, I want to introduce Dr. David Squires, who is our very first visiting assistant professor in digital humanities, a position that he shares between the English department and the CDSC. David took on this mammoth task of creating this symposium. I said, "Do you want to do a symposium?" He's like, "Yes." And I said, "All right, here you go." And he did it. He did all of this. And any of you know, if any of you have ever planned anything, you know that this is no small undertaking. So I first want to just thank David. And then I want to allow him to introduce the topic and introduce the speakers for the day. So David?
All right, thank you, Kim. Here's Trevor. I did not do this alone for sure, and I'll say more about that in just a second. I just want to say also, feel free to help yourself to coffee while I'm talking before the talks get officially started. When you inevitably need a restroom, they are around the corner this way. It's usually Trevor's job to say this, but they're beautiful. Examples of mid-century architecture, they're original to the building. There's also a staircase that's original to the building that you can go down. You can't come up it because the door's locked, but if you want to get out quietly without going past people, you can take the staircase down there, and it's gorgeous. I also want to note that we have a hashtag, so if you'd like to live tweet, feel free. It's hashtag CDSC 2016. If you're from Idaho, for instance, and you need Wi-Fi, there's a guest password up there. And if you'd like to see the schedule of events, it's at the events page at the CDSC website, and you can get that there. Okay. So, yes, let me welcome you officially now to the first symposium at the CDSC, Black Lives Matter, Technologies of Public Protest. When I started dreaming up this event, even more than a year ago, I was mostly concerned with how virtual spaces, especially through social media, seem to organize physical spaces of resistance to systemic racism. And many of you know the phrase Black Lives Matter comes from a Facebook. I have a slide here. A Facebook, there we go. A Facebook post from Alicia Garza. After George Zimmerman was accused of all wrongdoing in the death of Trayvon Martin, Garza wrote, "Our lives matter, Black lives matter." And the phrase stuck. And since then, the movement has paid special attention to material embodiment. Trayvon Martin's hoodie, Eric Gardner's breath, Michael Brown's hands. This seemed remarkable to me as an example of how physical and biological concerns permeate digital forums, despite what we've heard about living in a post-racial society. And since last year, though, it's really important to note a lot has happened. and the idea of post-racial society has really evaporated from public discussion. Instead, it seems to me that there's a new energy dedicated to insisting that our most prominent institutions commit to reform. And here at WSU, we're currently in the midst of a 2-year common reading program dedicated to social justice and what it might mean for our own institutional identity for our community. And we have a lot of familiar questions to ask about social equality, economic parity, and disciplinary integrity. My hope is that this symposium will help us consider that project in light of national debates and institutional reform and the role that media technologies play in negotiating it. As my fondness for the bathrooms probably suggests, one of the pleasures of my position as visiting assistant professor of digital humanities is working in this library. It opened its doors in 1950, boasting the latest in library technology. And at that time, that meant very sturdy electrical wiring, AC throughout the building, and pneumatic tubes for moving books. And those pneumatic tubes are still visible on the first floor. So if you take that staircase down, walk to the other end of the building, you can still see them. Probably, though, the library's most recognizable feature is the statue on the west-facing wall. Officially, that statue is named the Reader, although I'm told that old-school Cougs know it by the nickname Nature Boy, which is named after the Nat King Cole song, which was popular around the time of the building's construction. This is a heartening bit of trivia because the refrain of that song is a simple moral about education. The greatest thing you'll ever learn is just to love and be loved in return. That little lesson drew inspiration from 19th century social movements that responded to industrialization with calls for holistic reform. The author of the lyric, Eden Abez, is most famous for being a proto-hippie who lived under the Hollywood sign during the 1940s. A Nature Boy paid tribute to his back-to-nature philosophy. Released in 1948, the song made Abez and Nat King Cole very famous. It was a kind of crossover hit for Nat King Cole, his first one. But when Cole recorded it for a studio audience, that studio asked him to wear cake makeup to feminize his black masculinity for the sake of white audiences. In a few years, so that's what he looked like on TV. That's what he looked like in promotional photos. A few years after that, someone accused Abez of stealing the melody and sued him. And that charge was never proved, but he did end up paying $25,000 to settle, which is a lot of money in 1950. So music critics have noted the irony. A song about learning to love turned into an occasion for hateful social friction. I recall this bit of musical history to illustrate how problems of media production dovetail with broader social histories of popular culture, intellectual property, and racism. When told from the perspective of an endearing university tradition, we can begin to see how traces of institutional power leave their mark in unexpected ways. Those traces, however, are easy to forget and just as easy to dismiss as trivial. We are fortunate to have librarians, archivists, and scholars who see it otherwise. Many of the folks joining us today, as far away as Massachusetts and as close as the University of Idaho, have the historical sensitivity and the foresight to preserve such histories for us. So right now, for instance, we have an exhibit in our Manuscript Archives and Special Collections Division, which is led by Trevor Bond, the co-director of the CDSC. And that exhibit documents the history of student protests here on campus. It's fascinating to see the aesthetic transition from mid-century to the 1970s, to give you an idea of what that looked like. Really, it's a good exhibit, and you should all go see it. It's even better than the bathrooms, so high praise. It's instructive, though, to know that archivist Marco English built the exhibit around 2 panels of wall preserved from a campus building that was just demolished last year. The wall served as a forum for students to post flyers and notices, kind of like a Pinterest for radicals in the 1970s. That ephemeral medium of public announcement might easily have disappeared without an institutional investment in preserving it. Today, as we think about the anti-racist protests once again pushing back against deadly inequality, I want to offer this wall as a reference point. It should help us recognize both the banality and the power of media technologies to contest white supremacy. The unruly assemblage of posters prefigures the united yet diverse voices organized by hashtags like Ferguson, Say Her Name, and Black Lives Matter. And like this wall, those hashtags represent an ephemeral mode of protest that requires our concerted effort to preserve for historical memory. I'm very happy to report that the guest speakers we have with us today are making that effort. Their work is dedicated to preserving, historicizing, and theorizing different technologies of public protest. And before I introduce our first speaker, I want to say thanks to all the speakers, Teresa Zackodnik, Burgess Jules, and Andrea Russworm, for traveling considerable distances to be here today. Andrea came in at midnight last night, all the way from Amherst, Massachusetts, so she came a long way to be here. And it's not easy to get to Pullman, you all know that. So thanks to them. I want to thank the co-directors of the center, Kim Kristen Withy and Trevor Bond. This would not have been possible without their support and a lot of effort on their part. Michael Wynn, our digital applications librarian, deserves a special thanks for his tremendous effort to help coordinate this event. And similarly, our graduate assistants, Corinne Hedlund and Lacey Hope, have moved mountains and tons of chairs in order to make this happen. Finally, I have a number of very generous sponsors to thank for contributing to this event. The Department of English, the Gender Identity, Expression, and Sexual Orientation Resource Center, the Women's Resource Center, the College of Education, the George and Bernadine Converse Historical Endowment, the African American Student Center, the School of Politics, Philosophy, and Public Affairs. And finally, thank you all for showing up to make this a productive day and a productive series of conversations. So a round of applause for all our sponsors and contributors. And before you get rid of me, I'm going to introduce Teresa Zackodnik, our first speaker. Teresa joins us from the University of Alberta in Edmonton. I first encountered Professor Zackodnik's work while doing research on Ida B. Wells, one of the founders of the NAACP and an early theorist of intersectional forms of oppression. There's a lot written about Wells, but Professor Zackodnik's writing stood out for its sophisticated analysis of the transatlantic context that shaped Wells and her anti-lynching campaigns. I think almost every study of lynching addresses how it mobilized racial and gendered stereotypes to justify anti-Black violence. But Professor Zackodnik shows how gender anxiety specific to England, of all places, also played a hand in how Wells developed her critique of American violence. So she really expanded the territory to a transatlantic stage for thinking about why it's important to understand rhetoric when studying the history of lynching. That study of Wells became an important section of her most recent book, titled Press, Platform, Pulpit, Black Feminist Publics in the Era of Reform. It continues a career-long project to explicate early formations of African-American feminisms. Professor Zackodnik's 3 other books and numerous articles together make a compelling case for rethinking feminism as a much longer social phenomenon than we usually understand. One of my students told me just this week that we're now in the 4th wave of feminism, which was news to me. So I have a lot of reading to do. But it stuck in my mind because the historiography that traces various waves of American feminism tends to place that first one on the cusp of the 20th century, leading up to the suffrage in 1920. But Professor Zackodnik's research assembles a variety of 19th century figures, some familiar, some hardly known at all, who show us how feminism ran a distinctive thread through the abolitionist work African American women made public in the 19th century. It is a significant historical intervention, and as if that were not enough, Professor Zackodnik also dedicates a portion of her research to teasing out the relationship between public culture and forms of media. As the title Press, Platform, Pulpit suggests, she's interested not just in print media, but also other types of public address. By tracing the different rhetorical styles produced by specific historical and cultural conditions, for instance, she reminds us that speech, too, is a medium, and one that enters the public sphere mediated by material circumstances every bit as much as print, broadcast, and digital media. I really could speak at length about what her work has taught me over the years I've been reading But I'll move this along just by saying in conclusion that the most important thing her research has taught me is that historically rich and theoretically informed academic writing can be both incisive and eloquent. And I think that's easy to forget or miss, but not when reading work like hers. So please join me in welcoming Professor Teresa Zackodnik. We're going to do a little shuffle here. Oh, you have one. Oh, very nice. But I just have to remember to turn mine off.
Sure. Wow, that was, I mean, I'm used to thinking no one ever reads anything that we write as academics, right? So that was kind of amazing. Sure.
Sorry, we did have one shuffle to do. There you go.
Thank you. Great. Thank you so much for coming. There's way more people than I thought when I had my head down checking Twitter as you were all coming in. I really want to thank the university, the CDSC, and David especially for making this possible. And I'm so excited to hear the work of Burgess and Trey Andrea as we talk together today. It's going to be fantastic. I have that mildly terrifying role of having to go first, but I think it's actually much better than having to follow either of them. So, you know, mildly terrifying is good, I think, this morning. I'm sorry.
It's on. Let me see if I can.
Do I need to?
Can you hear that better?
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks. Thank you. Sorry about that. I just want to open by working off of the call that David provided us with, because it's really suggestive in a number of different ways. In that call, he's drawing our attention to Black Lives Matter self-definition as a unique contribution to the history of Black activism in its centering of those that have been marginalized with Black liberation movements. And I'll just move to, I guess, also this quote from Garza that I find pretty foundational for my thinking today. As David puts it, Black Lives Matter is a movement that asks us to imagine a new future continuous with past lives. Uniqueness and continuity are at the center of my attempts to think about what David names as Black material life, public protest, and political movement. In conversation with Robin Kelly at Oakland's Bethany Baptist Church in December of 2014, Fred Moten repeatedly named the carceral and police state's target as insurgent Black social life walking down the street. He also argued that both there are intense continuities between insurgent Black social life, perceived as threat now and in the past, as well as a historical tendency of Black social life to constantly imagine how to act. You can find that conversation on Vimeo, and I really recommend it. It's a very galvanizing dialogue between the two of them. I hear in Moten's remarks the changing same, theorized by the late Amiri Baraka. For Baraka, still can't hear? Okay. Let me see if whatever David did, unlock it. Is that now maybe it's going to be too, is that better? No.
No? No better? Maybe.
Could just yell.
That's up all the way. No.
That's the right knob. We
Okay.
were turning the wrong knob. Sorry.
Sorry, it takes a second PhD to turn the right knob. There we go.
Yeah. So this is better? Yeah? Okay. So if you didn't hear it, all I'm laying out is a move into this conversation between Fred Moten and Robin Kelly, in which Moten is naming these, for me, provoking conditions of insurgent Black life on and in the street as being targeted, but he's also drawing attention to intense continuities between those violences and that targeting now as well as in the past. And he's also arguing for this intense continuity of, as he phrases it, the historical tendency of Black social life to constantly imagine how to act. And now I'm moving to try to connect that to Amiri Baraka's notion of the changing same. So for Baraka, the changing same was not only and arguably not mainly an articulation of the ongoing, adaptive, and violent structuring of Blackness, as it's often recalled today, but a statement on Black social life's generative capacities. The changing same makes the past vitally part of the present moment, building generatively and non-antagonistically upon past cultural forms in the present. We might even say that the changing same refuses the distinction between past and present. For Baraka, the changing same also named the stance of Black social life, what Nathaniel Mackey called, quote, one of outsidedness and of alienation and resistance. Together, Black social life's stance and temporality were central to what Baraka called Black music, which he conceptualized as mobile, when he says the Negro's music changed as he changed, reflecting shifting attitudes, and which he also conceptualized as continuous, reflecting, and this is equally important as he put it, consistent attitudes within changed contexts. I think the stakes are multiple in understanding both the present conjuncture's conditions and Black resistance within that frame of intense continuities or the changing same. And yet it seems the changing same is being filtered as journalists, academics, and a wider public grapple with how to understand the connections between Black material and social life, Black public protest, and media technologies. I'm struck by the predominance of what we might call a filtered or contained historical turn in media coverage of and academic scholarship on Black Lives Matter that delimits continuities in Black public protest. This in turn repeatedly contains what we understand and can imagine to be the forms, range, and force of Black resistance itself. And so I find a photograph like this pretty important. In the current exercise of a selective historicizing as containment, I'd argue we see the work of the post-racial, not only in its attempt to occlude histories of racism and resistance, but also in its work to individualize the structural or systemic of both white privilege and anti-Black racism, to retain, recycle, and intensify old racisms alongside assertions of the end of race, to cast rights and claims to them as privileges to be extended or withheld, and to fracture what once were or could be solidarities and alliances. This work is alternatively called New Racism, Racial Neoliberalism, or Racisms Without Racism, to name only 3 ways of speaking about the post-racial. And what freedom is or has become under it is a central question, given that what the post-racial frees up is vigorous mobility or circulation of capitalism and racisms. Yeah, sure. So what the post-racial frees up is the vigorous. Maybe you want to sit closer to the front? I don't know. Yeah. So I'm just paying attention to the fact that what the post-racial frees up is a vigorous mobility and circulation of capital and racisms through circuits that link the territorial or national with the supranational or extraterritorial. These foreclosures on what can be and is the purview of the political, as instantiating a greater freedom for the usual of capital and racial capitalism, names but one significant reason for critically questioning a selective filtering of continuities in understandings of Black protest and freedom struggle. History, what histories are on the table, what pasts form intense continuities with the present, matter to the chronopolitics of both the post-racial and how technologies of Black public protest are being understood now. Overwhelmingly, Black Lives Matter is compared to the civil rights movement, a comparison that both makes sense given their shared use of direct action and disruption, and is nonetheless one that suggests no earlier, succeeding, or contemporaneous Black freedom struggle matters to an understanding of, or forms a critical political continuity with, Black Lives Matter and Black activism in the present. At times, this takes the form of disciplining Black Lives Matter to the standard of the civil rights movement's organization and achievement. Both online and print media coverage uses the comparison to find Black Lives Matter wanting on the points of leadership, whether centralized or charismatic, and articulated demands or platform. And this comparison then consequently dismisses the movement as temporary and unsustainable. This tendency was prevalent in early coverage that asked whether BLM was a new movement or a series of protests that would not or could not coalesce into a sustained political movement. And I think we still see it now. At other times, this takes the form of a focus on BLM's success at confrontational protest and its savvy use of media, social versus civil rights use of print media, which again aligns the two movements through comparison. And usually that comparison might go back to Joanne Robinson's use of the mimeograph to say that that's a slow technology, and so BLM, right, is able to use a much faster technology. Online print and media coverage, as well as academic scholarship, aligns BLM and civil rights through that shared tactic then of confrontational protests, but it marks them as distinctive from one another in their access and use of technologies. A similar tendency is at work in scholarship focused on particular social media platforms, especially Twitter, I think, but that might be because I pay more attention to Twitter. I'm not on Facebook. And so Twitter is often described as uniquely instrumental in facilitating public protest. Network counterpublics and the ability of protesters to create interpretive frames for the events they document and disseminate in real time eclipses, for me anyway, eclipses self-conscious work with the frames this scholarship itself is creating through its inattention to connective histories, or what we might call a networked knowledge of intense continuity, in both the ways Black material and social life are contained, and that containment is resisted or refused. I'd like to suggest that one way, and I'm drawing on David's language here again, to recalibrate to account for the richness of Black material life, is to consider media technology as changing same in Black public protest and politics. For just one way to do so, by putting together my interest in Black Lives Matter and Twitter with my research on early Black feminisms and their uses of the print press as media technology to create networked counterpublics, disseminate, and also shape their politics. With this stress on continuities, I'm thinking less along the lines of Anna Everett's interest in the migration, or what she calls homesteading, of select Black papers such as the Anglo-African or the Indianapolis Recorder or the Philadelphia Tribune, to the internet as an index of what she calls African Americans' robust technological participation in the nation's postmodern public sphere. Rather, I'm thinking much more about how to bring together the workings of press forms in print media and the user actions of social media. So to try to do that today, I'll move from thinking about media affordances to user actions to eventfulness and public time, as I think about ways to pursue continuities or collective thinking. So part one, I'm calling it chronopolitics of media affordances. In quoted statements by activists in Black Lives Matter on its website and in coverage and scholarship on the movement, social media's affordances figure prominently, from the history of the movement's genesis in a Facebook post, hashtagged response, and subsequent Tumblr and Twitter accounts, co-created by Alicia Garza, Patrice Cullors, and Opal Tometi, as David was reminding us of, to its hashtag activism on Twitter, and its self-defined tactic of, quote, taking the hashtag off of social media and into the streets. Scholarship on social media and Black Lives Matter activism foregrounds its newness, quoting activists such as DeRay McKesson on, quote, the fundamentally different tools available to organize and to resist. These new tools are often credited with an unprecedented ability to provide individual access to both networked information and the ability to disseminate it. So this is often cast as this digital space provides an alternative structure for citizen voices and minority viewpoints, and that's McKesson quoted again. Or the ability to create network counterpublics who have new opportunities to create and broadcast knowledge. It's also credited with the ability to refocus the attention of the mainstream public sphere through discursive and interpretive frames that organizers can make. And then 3, the ability to amplify anti-establishment narratives is seen as key to that technology. These are all affordances, though, that can also be understood as continuities linking BLM with earlier mediatized Black counterpublics, rather than marking a fundamental break from or development beyond them. The ways in which the early Black press emerged from communal reading practices and the literary societies that Black women came to dominate in number by the mid-19th century center just these affordances and practices of network knowledge, framing, and amplification. And it's super hard to find a photograph of an actual literary society, but what we can find are some interesting ones of reading rooms. It's pretty hard to find historical photos of African American readers. Black literary societies provided both fledgling white edited abolitionist papers and the Black press with content. This is true of what Black women would write for the Philadelphia Female Literary Association, which provided William Lloyd Garrison and his newspaper, The Liberator, with content as early as June of 1832. And you can go into that newspaper and see all of that located in the women's department. But these societies were also sites where Black women practiced, performed, and experimented with literary voice and self-representation, as well as with literacy, in ways that approximated what Elizabeth McHenry has called the ideals of civic participation. They were sites of communal reading that didn't require individuals to be textually literate, and they were understood to be political training grounds. So I'm interested in all of that, how all of that comes together. Black literary societies, in other words, were places where Black women not only imagined themselves as, but were the civic citizen subjects they were actively prevented from being in the larger democratic public sphere. These were places in which Black women refused their disappearances from that sphere, and through which their activities extended that political self-imagining or being to a Black counterpublic. Literary societies were also networked political training grounds, linked with a wider Black counterpublic through a feedback loop that saw their original compositions read in the societies, subsequently published in papers, and then those papers would be read aloud in other Black literary societies, but in barbershops, in people's homes, through that everyday communal Black reading practice. Both individual and collective production of media content and analysis was central to early Black newspapers, and that content often reframed public debates vital to African American life and political activism. So an example around the same time as abolition is, of course, colonization, right? That question that always seems to be asked, what do we do with, right, Black people who are now free? Communal reading and newspaper sharing was also so prevalent that we can't read a 19th or 20th century Black newspaper without hearing editors harangue subscribers for it. The practice resulted in a much wider readership than newspapers could build through subscription or through newspaper agents. And conservative estimates say at least a 10-fold increase in readership. That's far too conservative, people think, but it's really hard to track, right? How amplification and intensification is actually working in those circuits. So the upside was exponentially enlarged distribution and dissemination, or amplification. The downside was that papers repeatedly folded because they weren't financially sustainable as a result of those reading practices. In this idea of network knowledge, co-created and disseminated through this amplifying feedback loop of recirculation that I'm suggesting forms a continuity between Black protest in the past and its media technologies, as well as now. I'm thinking that there's an important continuity here in the act of taking space. In taking via political imagining and practice, civic and public space denied African Americans. And in taking public space, I'm seeing this continuity of protest across time, across platforms. So part 2, #activism or user actions. What activists are able to do with the affordances of social media is often credited to the user actions particular to the platform in question. Studies of #activism on Twitter point to the hashtag as an indexing system, a performative or interpretive frame, as producing assemblages, as having the interdiscursive capacity to lasso accompanying texts and their indexical meanings to an intertextual chain, and as a filter that slices the noise. That slicing both enables publics to emerge and provides the user with, quote, a distorted view of events, because events too emerge from and with that emergent public or network that filters Twitter's noise. These were also effects of reprinting, the mainstay of 19th and early 20th century press in the US. And this is true for the wider American press, but I'm arguing there's a very different function of reprinting when it's used within the Black press. So editors under reprinting form exchanges with editors at other newspapers, and through those exchanges what they do is share content, but then they also draw down or download content effectively from those exchanges. And what it means is that a 19th and even early 20th century newspaper really is an assemblage, that most of the content that you see there are these reprints. And it becomes very interesting to think about the politics of the exchanges that Black papers are marking, but also the way in which choices, strategic choices around things like layout can create these politically analytical, interpretive frames for readers, simply even by placing one piece alongside another and creating this possibility, I guess, of political analysis through their juxtaposition. Reprinting also shared freely, usually never credited the original publication with the reprint. So you might know what the exchanges are for a newspaper, but you can't pin down usually where a particular piece is coming from. It also makes it hard to decide or determine what's an original article in a newspaper that you're reading and what is just a reprint, right? I should never say just, what is a reprint? The practice was driven by these kinds of values. Republican values of decentralized power and the democratization of knowledge. And it's critically understood by people like Meredith McGill as being able to elevate local affairs to national prominence, and as being able to give writing by the socially marginalized a powerful cultural presence. So I'm really interested in the values that reprinting comes out of, but also the work we understand it can do. Reprinting not only kept fledgling Black papers viable and afloat, in turn keeping the counterpublics they created through address alive and developing, but Black editors used reprinting to reframe information for political ends, as I've described. It worked in ways that I think are similar to retweeting or quoting as endorsement or ideological opposition actions on Twitter. But it could also work in the ways that Sarah Jackson and Brooke Foucault-Wells examine when they track Twitter mentions during the Ferguson protests as shifting from amplification initially to the work of drawing mainstream public sphere elites into the conversation, as they put it. And they're also tracking that retweets come through the unfolding of those protests to amplify counter-public messages as well. I think of someone like Mariah Stewart, which might seem really bizarre because she's active in 1830, but that's a person that comes to mind when I think of this idea of amplification and drawing the mainstream into the conversation as a way to amplify, but also to implicate, I guess. So Mariah Stewart's use of the Liberator is worth exploring as a continuity, I think. Stewart's the first African-American woman to take to the public platform in a series of speeches that she gives in Boston in the early 1830s. And she sought out Garrison's newspaper to then subsequently publish those addresses in the paper. This is the same paper, right, that just a couple of years before she starts doing this work is publishing the Philadelphia Female Literary Association's work. So, and we know she's a newspaper reader because she had been reading and writing to Freedom's Journal before this work with the Liberator. So I'm seeing her as quite savvy about print technologies, but also about how you move the oral to print and you amplify as a result. Stewart arguably courted notoriety for its amplification effects. The notoriety not only of her newness or her uniqueness as a female speaking in public. So at that time, it's regarded as a masculine act. You desex yourself if you take to the platform. So she gets run out of Boston eventually, not only for the controversy of what she has to say, but because she's a woman in public space in a way that women should not occupy that space. But her militancy at the time is also quite notorious. What's called by critics her social gospel is part of a larger Black nationalist political discourse that rooted Black national identity in Black Christianity. But it's also a masculinized politic. So to take that on as a woman is pretty controversial. Stewart evidently understood reprinting as amplification, and the Liberator is capable of further intensifying it. Garrison was a sort of early master, I think, of reprinting to heighten the sense of his paper's impact. And there's this historian, Henry Mayer, who makes this case for what Garrison was able to do with the Liberator. And he says Southern editors not only saw the paper, but reprinted material from it, accompanied by bitter condemnation, which was then picked up by other papers and eventually worked over again by Garrison himself in the Liberator, in this kind of cycle that enabled the paper to, as Mayer puts it, put a noise out of proportion to its size or subscription base. It also amped up the threat that Garrison and immediate abolitionists were understood to pose to a pro-slavery South. And so a year before Stewart publishes her addresses in the Liberator, the paper's already been banned from DC, and African Americans who are found in possession of it face fines. They face 4 months of imprisonment. They even face a period of servitude, of enslavement, if they're actually found possessing it. Other states across the nation are offering rewards for whites who are found circulating it, and Garrison has rewards or prices put on his head in both the South and in New England as well. This is but one example of the way in which early Black feminists harnessed reprinting to amplify a politics that necessarily had to manage geographical distance and its effects on both information flow and imagined community or solidarity in its work to build counterpublics. Reprinting enabled a reflexivity that I've argued is a hallmark of early Black feminism. In fact, we might say that it shaped or became constitutive of that politics. In other words, both reprinting and recirculation, as I've described them, not only disseminated a Black feminist politics, but actively shaped it as a new form of subjectivity and identity. And I guess what I'm saying is that that recirculation happened in such an everyday and communal kind of way that it naturalizes what initially will appear as a pretty radical politics when what we would recognize now as feminism is first emerging on a Black counterpublic scene. But I'm also thinking of another example, and that's the UNIA's Negro World. And there's a shot of its cover on the left, but also Amy Jakes Garvey's work in the women's column, and there's an example of that on the right. So Jakes Garvey's column was called Our Women and What They Think, and it was an assemblage of reprints strategically chosen and also, I think, strategically positioned on the page. So I'm really sorry that I can't produce something that's blown up enough for us, and we don't really have the time to look at, I think, that juxtaposition, but it's really smart the way she sets up, for example, labor conditions for African Americans right alongside apartheid conditions in South Africa, for example. Or the other thing that she's doing is assembling reportage on women's condition all around the world, right? So from Russia to England to the Philippines, Turkey, and this is all there on the page for you to read if you're a Garveyite woman attracted and drawn to the page. It's an assemblage that also includes reader-generated content. So she invited repeatedly readers to not only submit letters to the editor, which we're a lot more used to as a press form for reader contribution or democratic debate, I guess, in the newspaper, but to get them to actually write articles. And they did. Really interesting work. But she also asked them to send in newspapers. And so she's actually able to make these connections to places that I don't think we'd anticipate. And the Black Pacific is one of those things that I see her as able to open up in a way that maybe the UNIA itself doesn't open up in quite the same way. There's a UNIA chapter in Sydney, but people are writing to her about Papua New Guinea, for example, and colonial abuses going on there when the Australian government takes it over from the Germans. So the column is addressing readers, I'm saying, in a multi-voiced and international reportage on women's condition in nations around the world, the condition of laboring people, regardless of racial identification, both domestically and internationally, and the voices of Garveyite women within the African diaspora. In other words, Jakes Garvey's column is multi-voiced and dialogical in character in a way that is central to its Black nationalist politics. So some of the work I've done is to try to produce digital visualizations of place in the way that Jakes Garvey's column is animating it. And we can see in this slide the location of letters that are coming in to the editor, to the page. I think this doesn't surprise us in terms of Garveyism, perhaps except for the letter that's coming out of Australia and this kind of odd one, too far north, right? But it maps this sort of circum-Caribbean, right? It shows us, I think, too, that Garveyism's stronghold isn't just within the US in New York and Harlem or in the South, but that it's reaching into the Midwest, too. The reprints in Our Women are really interesting for that kind of global character that I'm talking about. And so I guess what I'm seeing in those digital visualizations is the way in which there's a consciousness that's being actively shaped and formed. And the consciousness that Jakes Garvey is building for her readers is a Black internationalist consciousness, one that actually exceeds Garveyism and its tendency to focus on the Black diaspora, but amplifies it, magnifies it much further beyond that. So to turn back to social media technologies now. When academics argue that the difference of Twitter is its multivocality and dialogicality, I think of newspapers and columns like Jake Scarvey's in the Negro World, and I also think of the hashtag as a form of seriality, one that not only aggregates into an indexical system, but one that also mediates between newness and the repeated or the already known, between the specific of any given tweet and the existing social formation or social situation in which it occurs and to which it deliberately marks a relation. This language is how Jim Mussel speaks of seriality in print media forms. Repeated structures, genres, and forms in print media, like a column, work constitutively, quote, mediating both specific utterances and social situation, so that both writers and readers are able to connect the new to the already known. This may sound like a media remediation argument, or worse, as mistaking analogy for analysis. But I'm working to suggest that in thinking about seriality, print, and social media forms together, and the available user actions in each, both in terms of what they are understood to do and what, if any, continuities we understand them to form, that we should be working to foreground the social life of the form rather than reading social life off of the form. And that's a phrasing that I'm drawing from Gonkar and Povinelli's work on circulation. Neither print nor social media, as they were and are being used for Black counterpublic and protest purposes, are simply vehicles for content dissemination. And as I'll explore in my final section, I think that this question of the social life of the form is a live one for public protest technologies right now. This is what I hear in Deva Woodley's caution to, quote, avoid confusing the technology for the movement itself. And it's here in the thinking about the social life of, rather than read off the form, that a turn to the temporality social media is said to create might be useful. And so this is my last section, eventfulness in public time. A significant element in the perceived uniqueness of social media and its affordances for public protest is temporality. Speed is one of the 5 markers of social media's ability to facilitate public protest, as NYU's Social Media and Political Participation Lab has it. And it would be interesting to go into SMAP and take a look at it, because there are other ways in which speed is implicit in some of those 5 additional markers. So speed's a pretty big thing. Social media's temporality is central to its protest facilitation, is alternatively cast as the speed of information dissemination, as the real-time engagement and community that it enables, and as what Stephen Bijan calls a source of live, raw information. And Bijan goes on to say this: it could summon people to the streets and coordinate their movements in real time, and it could swiftly push back against spurious media narratives with the force of a few thousand retweets. Social media's temporality is also described as heightened by its ability to, quote, create unique feelings of direct participation. And together these form what Bonilla and Silva call Twitter's eventfulness, as they dub it. But senses of time and temporality, as produced by media technologies, strikes me as a more complex question than emphases upon speed suggest. Media technology creates, particularly in perceived moments of change, a very different sense of time and space for its users. Media historians describe the explosion of print media in the final decades of the 19th and into the early 20th century as radical expansion during what they called a period of rapid industrialization, increased immigration, the rise of the corporation and capital markets, and the migration of workers from rural locales into cities. But that work also notes that how print media was talked about, quote, reflected and shaped what Americans took reality to be. With enhanced production and circulation, both time and distance were experienced as collapsed by what was perceived to be a, quote, dizzying pace of change at the time. People, in other words, perceive media change as speed. And we might say similar things of the way in which Twitter's speed is said to create temporal experiences of eventfulness or immediacy that collapse the distances of time and space between users, between user and event. And here I'm suggesting that what we take to be the unique possibilities that media innovations create may be our perception of media change itself, or that perception is at least part of what we understand those technologies to actively create. And speed is, after all, relative, which is illustrated, for example, by the feel of some social media platforms as, quote, too slow for Ferguson. And that's a sense that Bonilla and Rosa argue people had of Facebook under the Ferguson protests. Woodley's caution not to mistake the technology or social media for the movement or reality is one to heed, particularly when we are mindful that what Black Lives Matter particularly and repeatedly draws into the frame is slow violence. So I'm very interested in trying to think about emphases on speed and how that sits alongside a movement that is arguing that we pay attention to slow violence. It is here that the presumed shared time of eventfulness may actually surface an important rupture in what we think we all share on Twitter. In their work on #Activism during Ferguson, Bonilla and Rosa bury in a footnote what they call, quote, contrasting racialized chronotopes. Both that burial in the footnote and the rupture it nonetheless testifies to are very interesting to me. Contrasting racialized chronotopes are what Bonilla and Silva dub the misfit between perceptions of, quote, increased mediatization of events as a sign of increased rates of police brutality, end quote, and what Black Lives Matter is using this mediatization to convey, which is what has always been rampant. Bonilla and Silva continue. From the vantage point of predominantly white communities that have not faced it, police brutality is often viewed as a practice taking place there and now. From the vantage point of people who have faced police brutality in their communities for generations, such brutality is often used as a practice that has always taken place here. If the eventfulness of Twitter is achieved by the sense of immediacy conveyed in and by speed, it is an immediacy that may bridge there and here through a shared experience of now, but I think that comes at the risk of an understanding that for Black lives, now is always and here. Eventfulness does not ensure a shared knowledge of space, its violences, and the stakes of taking it. But I think that work with what Teju Cole calls public time as the chronological equivalent of public space might help us understand how the misapprehension eventfulness risks is perhaps refused or could be refused. Black Lives Matter protests and the police brutality around which they are organized show us time and again that public space is racialized through the violent exclusion or disappearance of African Americans from it and through their precarity within it, achieved through the deliberate misapprehension of Black bodies as threat in a securitized white supremacist state. As Catherine McKittrick helps us to understand, Black geographies are and have always been essential to racializing space through their repeated construal as, quote, out of space, or as, quote, belonging in not belonging. For McKittrick, as for Baraka and Moten, Black geographies or Black social life has been and is insurgent, mobile, continuous, and revealed in the ruptures that expose the limitations of public space and that refuse a linear or progressive temporality. Black geographies radically question whose time, whose space, which is what I understand as at stake in Baraka's changing same, Moten's intense continuities, and the current conversation on Black protest technologies. Social media's speed and feeling of immediacy can be used strategically for protest purposes, but I don't think they're to be mistaken for the movement's work to take or rupture public space, to refuse a temporality of progression for one of slow violence and mourning, all of which is the changing same of the here, always, and now. Thank you.
We have time for questions about the talk.
I was blown away by that presentation.
Oh,
That was
thanks.
So amazing. I was really struck with your last part. You do a lot of work in media archaeology, which talks about the fact that different media mediate time in different ways, like you said.
Yeah.
And I wonder, I don't know a lot of the sort of Black African American histories that you talk about,
Yeah.
or Baraka's work.
Yeah.
But I wonder if you could also conceptualize sort of multiple temporalities occurring with Black Lives Matter, and multiple movements sort of interacting, and a kind of like Deleuzian kind of rhizomatic structure.
Yeah, I think that's huge, and there's a lot of, I mean, you could go to Bergson too, right? And his philosophical notions of, the present is not distinct from the past nor from the future, or Liz Gross's work, right, as she works with Bergson. But for me, I think time is a huge thing. I think time and place are so important. And for me, that's why I'm really drawn to Catherine McKittrick's work on demonic grounds. I don't know if you know it. So smart, so interesting. And she's working with a number of different things there, but she is always thinking about space and time together, and working with people who are attentive to the repeated refusal of their fracturing, right? But it's her that her idea of rupture is what I find really interesting, right? Especially when we think of our own moment and the post-racial, and the way the post-racial wants to occlude or tamp down or make it really difficult to for people to see the importance of knowing about the past, right? So for me, another way to understand Black Lives Matter is that it's undertaken that really high stakes and important work of repeated rupture, right? Of a situation where we're not supposed to see these things, we're not supposed to make these connections. And it's a repeated insistence, I think, too, in the face of the post-racial, to say this is political, right? Because the post-racial has made it difficult to talk about race as a matter of political concern, because it maps it so strongly as a matter of individual bias, right? Yeah. So I'm all for connections. Yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah.
That was great. Thank you very much for that. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how the hashtags and Twitter both can amplify these messages as well as sort of oversimplify them and downplay, so that that's always happening at the same time. And so we have this movement between, this long history of protest and violence, and then this sort of use of technology that gives us sound bites and gives us quick things and amplifies it, but by amplifying it, you're only amplified for, as long as that Twitter cycle. So
Right.
can you maybe just talk a little bit about
Yeah.
that?
So I'm looking here because my wheelhouse is really not Twitter like it is for someone like Burgess, right? But I have been reading a lot about it, trying to understand it because of those connections that I'm thinking of. I don't know. I mean, for me, when I'm on Twitter, I'm always trying to do that deeper work. I think that's the other thing that I worry about with speed, is how fast we can move through this, rather than taking the time to land, as you're suggesting, and then drill deeper or dig deeper in a way. So I actually think that goes even beyond the hashtag or Twitter as a platform. Like, I just think of the way in which how much I'm on the phone and using that as a technology for, and we were talking about this a bit last night, right? Reading in different ways for different depths or stretches of engagement, right? And we were saying that we tend not to do that on a screen, right? So I just think there's a lot more than Twitter and the hashtag going on in that, right? It's like what we use our phones for in addition to when we're on a social media site that sort of scripts, I think, or I see it for myself, my understanding of what I'm doing when I'm on Twitter, right? And so, yeah, limited. I also worry about, right, Jody Dean's notion of, right, this fantasy of engagement that can be produced through those platforms so that somehow we are engaged in activist work just by using Twitter. Yeah, that would be something I think we'd want to think a lot about, but I don't know, Burgess, if you,
So we're in a room with, scholars and students who are really interested in it. So I think it's worth it to talk about, how we dig deeper into some of these social media messages. But, to me, the simplicity is the thing that makes it work for sort of what it's doing now, right? Folks are in a small town in Missouri, and, they're amplifying, they're putting messages out, and those messages have to be simple for people to latch on. And that's the power of the thing. And I think if we look at how the movement has grown, we understand that people don't just stop at looking at the Twitter messages, right? The thing about a tweet is it looks simple, but on the back end of it, it's really a complicated thing. So you can include links, you can include videos, you can include all these other things that could sort of draw people in and help people sort of get connected to whatever message you're trying to send. So I think the simplicity of it is very powerful, and it's what's allowed these messages to sort of reach far and wide and international audiences as well. So we shouldn't discount that. But I do, agree that we need to look deeper. And I think when you talk about sustaining movements, right, that's when that comes into play. So how long does folks' attention sort of stay on a topic? Do they actually click on the Campaign Zero website link that's in a tweet and sign up, right, to do some work for that organization? Or do they sign up to do work for the Black Lives Matter organization with their, major platform that they just released? So in a lot of ways, it could lead to that, but in some ways, folks might stop right at the tweet, right?
Those are all very good points about social media, especially Twitter, and how it amplifies and so forth. I don't know if you've seen recently that Twitter is in a bit of financial trouble, and one of the companies that may take it over is Disney. So that worries me a bit. Because Twitter has this sort of democratizing effect that folks here have just talked about, and you have very eloquently, and I'm just worried about the fact that a bottom line is coming in here about something that is important. It's not as seen as sexy or as interesting as Snapchat and Facebook, Instagram. It's just there was something on NPR this morning, people saying that it was a bit dull. The phone app is dull, and so not many people are it's not growing the way it should. So it's right for a takeover by Disney or other. So.
Do you want to speak to that?
I mean, it's a corporation. I mean, they're set up to make money. It just so happens that this one has helped a lot of people share their messages. So that's what we focus on as folks interested in building collections. Who buys it, who sells it? If it goes away tomorrow, that doesn't really, we think about it, but we're more interested in the data and what it's doing now. And we're interested in figuring out ways to save that data now in ways that are ethical, which I'll talk about. But yeah, things happen to companies that are on the stock market. That's just how it is,
Yeah, and I guess it would face, right? That would be part of a long history of linking media technologies with Black politics and Black protest, right?
Yeah, and actually, Jarrett Drake is an archivist at Princeton University, and he has a great article in this publication called Technology Philly. And he talks about why we shouldn't put too much trust in places like Facebook and Twitter to be these sort of socially conscious spaces. So it's worth a read if you want to. It just came out yesterday, I think. And we can share links later.
I'm going to try to speak to everybody all at once,
Yeah.
so everybody can hear. But I have a question about a concern that a lot of people who study Twitter and other social media raise about algorithmic siloing or algorithmic bubbles and the possibility of a counter-public through social media. A lot of people say that it's no longer possible to have a counter-public because everybody is so much attuned to just their own reading community, which is too small to be public. But some of the historical examples that you gave made me wonder if reading publics or reading communities have always been small and they form publics way beyond their actual readers. And there was a really lovely phrase that you used about Mariah Stewart's paper being able to create more noise than, or out of proportion, enough noise out of proportion to its base. And I wonder if that could be a way of thinking about Twitter as well.
Yeah. I don't quite know where to start, except that I guess by definition, when we're using the phrase counterpublic, we are by definition talking about this notion of smaller networks or smaller, right? And so, sometimes the phrase the black public sphere is used, but I always think there's multiple black counterpublics, right? And sometimes they're networked or connected, and sometimes they're not. And I don't know that the vitality of political work always needs to be about that connectedness, because sometimes that connectedness can mean that a multiplicity of political concerns are getting condensed or forced to coalesce into singular ones. But again, you put it to all of us, and I don't know if Andrea or Burgess want to come in on that question, right? Of silos with Twitter, right?
Well, I want to press the historical point and ask again, or more specifically, can we see silos in the abolitionist papers? Is there any evidence that the slave owners who were reacting actually read those papers or had access to them? Or did they just know that they were there and reacted to them because of their presence?
Yeah, well, I would say all the reprinting is evidence that they're really interested in it, that they think that knowledge is something that they have to have. They're worried about, right? They're worried about other people, enslaved people, as well as free African Americans having that knowledge. I think they knew a lot about it, right? So, and not only because of reprinting, but I would think they would know about it kind of in the first instance as well. But I feel like there was a different question behind that. So it's about how does that politics get out? Or how is it still siloed?
I guess maybe I'm just trying to figure out more about what the noise is that's beyond its base. If the base is people actually read the paper, what is the noise and how do people understand that as a text that can be organized as a public text?
Right. So I guess for me, the noise would be kind of the panoply of politics, both within a wider American democratic public sphere, if we're going to use that language, and then these political positions that we locate in black counterpublics, right? And black papers are producing all of that. And so for me, it's like they help to slice or filter that noise in things like strategic layout decisions, or sometimes the way they'll build series, right? And later in the 19th century and into the early 20th, there's this real draw to kind of authorities that you'll have in to come speak on an issue like industrial education or the woman question or those kinds of things. So I think that's how they're filtering it. But I also think readers show you they're filtering it through the letters that you read they write in, right? And then there's also the fact that an editor chooses what letter they're actually going to print in the paper, which is another way that they are able to filter what they're trying to create or manage as a conversation or a politics, right? So those are just some thoughts, yeah.
I have another question.
Yeah.
Just to sort of maybe reframe a way that you guys were talking about it, maybe it's a question of signal to noise ratio. Because I keep hearing this question of the depth of Twitter versus the simplicity of getting a message out. One of the reasons why Twitter is so simple is, or so effective sometimes, is because it can reach a wide number of people and they can recontextualize these things like reprinting.
Yeah.
But I think there's always in Twitter and maybe also in the newspaper this question of like, at what point is your signal kind of gone, right? At what point does reprinting and retweeting kind of disseminate the message so much that you don't really have control over it anymore, and how much control can you leverage over it? And maybe that's, I don't know how they dealt with that with the reprints.
Well, and I don't even know how much they can know that, just like how much we can know now about both historical readers, but also about users now. So I don't know, sometimes I think that the action, again, stands in for what we want to impute user intent to be, right? But we don't know, but we still impute that, right? Same with letters to the editor. You sort of take them as though they're transparent, but no, people make rhetorical decisions about what to write, and you don't even know what the range of views a newspaper received on an issue actually was. We just have what was printed, right? So, because historical readers, we really can't access them, I thought for a little while about, well, some people would argue then you look at them as users, and then you look at how they're also using reading and writing in different ways and modes around the newspaper to try to build that, but I don't really know about that either. So it's a great question. I have no answer. I don't know how it could even be determined, but I think that that's actually interesting, because maybe it puts the brakes on some of what we credit media technologies with doing, because they mean different things for different people, right? I don't know. Again, I feel like I don't know as much as the people we'll hear from next will about that.
I have another question. Double questions. One of the big concerns about studying race in the 20th century was difference, and not just race, but other kinds of social formations, is paying respect to difference, understanding it, tracking it, and that makes some people nervous because movements like Black Lives Matter tried to create a kind of coalitional politics that, although rooted in African American protest or Black protest, is definitely not limited to that. And so people say, oh, you're erasing differences, and that becomes a real anxiety for protest. It strikes me that some of the 19th century examples of juxtaposition, particularly in the Garvey, Jake's Garvey paper, that seems like a really savvy strategy for creating continuity without collapsing difference. And I wondered if there was any evidence of that anxiety about difference in the 19th century.
Well, so if you think about what we usually call the first wave of feminism, it's huge then, right? Because it's about that movement pitting people against one another over this mythology of scarce resources, right? And it tries to position African American women as needing to choose between women's rights, right? The vote for women or the vote for Black men, and nothing, right, that actually speaks to their intersectionality in that demand, right? And so you can see feminists like Harper, Anna Julia Cooper, thinking really hard about that and how to respond to it, but also sometimes sounding like they're making strategic decisions that mean that they're that they're on the record as, say, choosing race first and womanhood second, right? So So what you're talking about also goes to the political pressures on difference at certain moments, right? And I mean, I guess what I see is a history of making strategic decisions about how to manage that. I think that Jake Scarvey is in a really different position come the mid-20s because she is part of and able also to work within a context that precedes her of Black internationalism that is going after intersectionality, right? As a way of refusing that kind of siloing that then just pits people against one another. It's a much more dangerous force, right? Like Fanon would say, that's the big danger, are those coalitions, right? So coalitions is very interesting. Also, the ways in which there are attempts to contain it are really interesting too, yeah. That's about what I have to say about that. It's certainly a live issue in the past, yeah.
All right. Thank you, Teresa.
Thank you.